Welcome to the QSBI ESG Podcast. For our first interview episode, we're here with Isabelle Hall at Monitor Deloitte.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you. So, I am currently a senior manager in Deloitte's strategy consulting practice, where I lead teams on a diverse range of client engagements, including strategy development, op model design, and large scale enterprise transformation. My experience spans both private and public sector clients with a particular focus on ESG related projects, trying to do that type of work as much as I can here at Deloitte. Some notable ESG projects I've led at Deloitte include developing a sustainable finance framework and program for a financial crown corporation here in Canada, supporting an apparel company and shaping its circularity strategy along with a number of other projects. But prior to joining Deloitte, I earned a master's in social entrepreneurship from USC in LA, where I deepened my understanding of leveraging business for positive social impact while also driving financial sustainability for the enterprise. So my passion for social enterprise was really shaped by 2 years working in the social sector across Africa, where I worked for a social enterprise dedicated to supporting female founders and scaling their businesses, as well as working for a global crowdfunding platform, which was a nonprofit. So these experiences really reinforced my passion for using business as a force for good, and I hope to continue to do that throughout my career.
Wow, you have an insane resume, super cool stuff on there, and I'm so excited to hear more about it. So thank you for joining us today. So I think based on all your experience, it'd be really interesting to hear more about the intersection of nonprofits and the private sector, like your experience with it. In your view, what are the most important differences in how ESG strategy is approached in the nonprofit sector versus the private sector, and where do you see each placing greater emphasis compared to the other?
So ESG strategy in the nonprofit sector versus the private sector, I would say, differs mainly in purpose, emphasis, and measurement. So first, in terms of purpose and orientation,
Mhm.
nonprofits view ESG as integral to their mission, right? So social and environmental impact is the core reason for their existence. So ESG is really embedded in their org design, program design, community engagement, and advocacy. Whereas with private sector companies, they often approach ESG as a balance between shareholder value and stakeholder expectations. So it's really more framed in terms of risk management, long-term value creation, and or regulatory and reputational considerations. Then in terms of priorities, nonprofit prioritize social and environmental outcomes, right? So for example, serving vulnerable populations, advancing inclusion, or addressing systemic issues like climate justice. Private sector actors, on the other hand, tend to prioritize governance, risk, and environmental performance. So, especially today, carbon footprint reduction, supply chain transparency, and there are a number of new sort of regulations out there in the world, and companies have to act quickly to get in line. And ultimately, private sector companies that focus on ESG really protect their license to operate in that they're following regulation, attract capital. As you would know, investors today are looking at companies through a different lens to ensure that they're operating responsibly, that they are hitting on certain ESG metrics. So the ability to demonstrate your focus on ESG can help you attract more capital in some cases in the private sector. And an ESG focus for private sector companies can help them to differentiate in the market, right? Employees and customers today are more interested in companies that operate responsibly and have some form of environmental or social impact. And then finally, with regards to measurement and accountability, so nonprofits typically measure their success by mission impact. So, lives improved, awareness raised, systems changed, and they will report these often to their funders, their donors, as well as communities they serve and or operate in. And then private companies emphasize more quantifiable metrics tied to investors and regulators. So emissions reductions, ESG ratings, or diversity targets.
It's very interesting to see how, like, they definitely approach ESG very differently, and, like, I feel like see it in a very different light. It makes, like, sense versus private versus nonprofit, but it definitely is completely different. Capital versus, again, like, lives. Yeah, I think the approaches really change, like, how they work with ESGs. Next question, what do you see as the key strengths and limitations of nonprofits versus private companies when it comes to advancing the ESG goals?
I'll start with nonprofits. So, strengths for nonprofits when it comes to advancing ESG goals include their mission driven focus, I think. So, nonprofits are founded with a social or environmental purpose. So, ESG goals are really aligned with their core DNA. In terms of strengths, I would say their deep community engagement. So, nonprofits typically have strong local connections and trusted relationships with communities. So, this can enable them to really understand local needs and tailor their ESG initiatives effectively and mobilize grassroots support in the communities that they're partnering with. And then, third strength, I would say, is expertise and innovation. So, most nonprofits possess specialized knowledge in areas such as climate change, social justice, education, and they're often at the forefront of developing innovative solutions and best practices that can be scaled or adopted by other sectors. In terms of limitations, I think one that really stands out to me is resource constraints. So, funding is often short term, restricted, or donor driven. And when I say restricted, donors sometimes will say, here's an amount of funds that can only be used for this type of activity. So that sort of ties the hands of the nonprofit to use the funds in a more adaptive way if, new issues come up for the constituents that they're serving. So it can really limit scale and consistency. Another limitation I would say is operational reach, given their sort of size, many nonprofit organizations, their ability to influence, global supply chains or large scale emissions is really limited compared to larger private sector actors. And then finally, in terms of limitations, I would say measurement challenges. So often with nonprofits, their impact is sometimes qualitative or harder to quantify, which can make it difficult to benchmark progress or communicate progress and impact at times. So moving to private sector companies, it's almost in many ways the flip of nonprofits. So strength, scale, and resources, right? They can deploy capital, technology, and leverage to drive ESG change at a larger scale. Data and measurement capabilities. Private sector companies are increasingly using standardized ESG metrics, right? Because they have a requirement to report out on a lot of these to their investors or regulators. So this allows private sector companies to have more accountability or comparability and measurement of the impact that they're having. And then third strength for private sector, I would say, is influence and leadership, right? So these are typically large scale corporations that have the ability to really set industry standards and influence suppliers, partners, competitors. So their commitment to ESG can actually drive greater change across a given sector in order for their competitors sort of to remain competitive or keep up with them if customers are really more interested in the sort of impact driven approach that one company might take. In terms of limitations, ESG goals can often take a backseat when they conflict with short term financial performance. So, even if I think of examples of working with clients and encouraging them to embed sustainability or ESG considerations in their strategy, they often see the upfront investment and aren't interested because they have sort of financial targets that they need to hit and they don't want to make this large investment up front despite that investment being very value creating in the long term. Another limitation is greenwashing risk. So pressure to appear ESG compliant can lead to sort of superficial initiatives or the market viewing you to be doing good just to look good versus actually genuinely transforming the way that you operate. And finally, governance and complexity, right? So multinational operations with diverse stakeholders can make ESG strategies harder to implement consistently.
I did not know greenwashing was such like a big limitation for companies. Obviously, I knew it was a thing, but I didn't know it was something they like really considered. That's quite interesting. That's such a big thing. So moving forward, so for many of our listeners, this may be their first time they're hearing about like band-aid versus community-led approaches, which is something we've talked about before. Could you please explain what these practices mean?
Sure. So Band-Aid approaches refer to sort of quick fixes or temporary solutions that address the immediate symptoms of a problem rather than its root causes. So, for example, providing food aid to a community experiencing hunger certainly helps in the short term, but it doesn't address the reasons why people are hungry in the first place and what change is required to reduce hunger in said given community. In contrast, community-led approaches involve working directly with local people to identify challenges and develop long-term sustainable solutions. So what this really means is listening directly from the community on what their needs are, leveraging the knowledge and strengths that they have and supporting them to really lead the change themselves. So, for instance, instead of just going back to the example I had before, instead of just delivering food, a community-led approach might focus on supporting local agriculture, and creating job opportunities and improving access to food, which is more sort of tackling the underlying causes of hunger.
Yeah, so now that like people know a bit more of what those two terms are, here's just some questions like to follow. So why do you think Western NGOs or nonprofits often default to these kinds of interventions? Is it a matter of urgency, funding expectations, or something deeper?
I do think urgency and funding expectations are certainly part of it. So with regards to urgency, in a serious crisis, it's easier to deliver something quickly, right away, that's visible to people. On the funding front, donors do often expect quick results and want to see measurable outputs quickly. So, that could be great. We just saw 100 meals delivered. Our money's done something. Or, our money had 1,000 vaccines distributed to this community. So it's just something that donors like to see. But I would also say on a more sort of macro scale, there's a bit of a mindset issue that exists. So a lot of large NGOs were built around this top-down model of helping. So putting served communities in more of a passive role rather than making them partners. So community-led approaches can take longer and they require more trust and patience. And oftentimes people don't really want to wait around. They're impatient to see impact and results quickly.
Yeah, I feel like investors, the media, everyone, honestly, probably society as a whole is quite impatient, wants to see like, fast returns, but I feel definitely community led and like long term will end into the best result, long term fixes
Yeah, more sustainable.
for sure. So another question is, what do you think are the dangers of exporting Western style solutions into communities with entirely different social, cultural, or economic contexts, like in different countries?
So I would say the real danger of this is that they often don't fit and sometimes they can actually do harm. So a program that looks good on paper in Toronto might completely miss cultural norms, local priorities, or economic reality somewhere else. And they can often create a dependency instead of empowerment and can even sort of destabilize local systems. So, for example, sending a bunch of free goods to a community could wipe out local businesses, right? And I think kind of going back to that mindset piece I was speaking to earlier, I think assuming outsiders know best actually risks sidelining the people who live with these challenges every day, who really have a view on what change they want to see and how that change could come about and have more insight into what will resonate with the community. What are ways of living or approaches to solving the issue that people locally can adapt themselves versus relying on some external party to come in and do something their way for them in a way that won't necessarily stick.
Yeah. No, I think it's so important. I think it's something that's definitely overlooked when the creation of charities that are like out of Canada, like they're a global charity. I think it's definitely something overlooked and people should have more people on the ground to help out.
Yes, and I will say too, what I'm seeing more of lately is even Western organizations. So, like MasterCard Foundation, for example, they're doing a lot of work across Africa and they were founded in North America. But what I'm seeing is that in the markets that they're serving, they're hiring people locally. So rather than hiring a Canadian or an American for a job in Kenya, they're hiring local Kenyans to lead programs, etc. But I think there is sort of this awareness now with some of these larger scale nonprofits in Western parts of the world that are seeing the value and importance of engaging people locally.
Yeah, I think it's also such a great thing, just get jobs.
Yeah.
So we kind of talked about this earlier, but if you want to dive a little deeper, so donors often want to see like quick, tangible results. How can nonprofits make the cause for longer term community driven work when the outcomes might be slower or less photogenic?
I would say that nonprofits can focus on storytelling and evidence. This is something that I really focused on in my job at Global Giving, which was the global crowdfunding platform. Part of my role there was to consult with different nonprofits across Kenya who were using the platform to crowdfund. So basically, what the platform did is allowed nonprofits across the globe to post their projects online to gain access to an international network of donors. And part of my role when I visited these nonprofit partners was helping them to understand how they can leverage storytelling to increase donor engagement. And so I think this is a really important piece in also sort of encouraging this longer term community driven view, showing how, small early wins are part of a larger sustainable impact and really highlighting the voices of community members who are leading the change. So that donors can say, okay, there's a local person engaged who sees what they're doing is working and knows it resonates because they come from there. So I think storytelling and evidence is a big piece, as well as sort of, I guess, related to the storytelling pieces is framing the story or the opportunity as an investment rather than a one-off project. Will help donors see that sort of this slower community driven approach actually produces results that stick. And that's ultimately more powerful than sort of a quick temporary fix, as we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, no, I think it's so important. Should definitely be more like normalized throughout charities and companies worldwide. So, pivoting a little from impact strategies and going into a topic that you're very familiar with from your previous work at all the nonprofits. So, like different funding and donation strategies, which you've done. So, now that you work in a private sector, we'd be really curious to learn more about that intersection. What are some ways nonprofits can leverage public sector strategies to increase funding besides donations?
Yeah, I would say that there are a few, actually, probably many ways that nonprofits can adopt private sector strategies to really diversify and increase funding beyond traditional donations. So, a few examples could be sort of the social enterprise route, which is something I very much sort of dove into through my work experience and education. But what I mean by this is developing revenue generating products or services aligned with their mission. So, for example, this could be selling merchandise, offering training programs, or launching like a fee for service activity to create more sustainable income streams. So, a nonprofit I was working with in Kenya, for example, had basketball programs for women because, or for young girls, because they recognize that a lot of these large reputable universities were in high demand for female athletes. And so they said, wow, this is actually an opportunity. If we get the girls in our community to be athletes, they can likely get access to better education. But in order to create sort of a sustainable revenue stream for themselves, they charged a small fee to their athletes to participate in the program. Nothing huge that would put people out in a community that's not sort of rich with wealth, but just a small fee that they ended up using to pay their coaches. So that's one example. Another way could be to create sort of a tiered membership model that would offer, greater benefits or events or content in exchange for recurring fees. This was also something that I worked on in my other role in South Africa with She Leads Africa, the social enterprise I mentioned. Basically, they served as I said, female founders and help them to scale their businesses. But we created a membership model that if you join this membership, you'd get one-on-one calls with our CEO. You'd get access to a pool of mentors that you could have conversations with. We would review pitch decks for you. So things like that, creating, being able to offer some of your services or, whatever your impact is for free, but then finding ways that you could potentially gain access to revenue streams otherwise. The other thing I've heard of folks doing is licensing their IP for a fee. So this could be, any deep research a nonprofit organization has conducted, or methodologies or educational content, for example. Nonprofits could ultimately kind of sell some of that or access to that to other organizations, nonprofit or otherwise.
Interesting. I've never heard of that one before. It's really interesting how you can mix business strategy and charity and nonprofits together. And like, I think for me, someone who wants to maybe go into that space, it's definitely really cool to hear that I can use all my knowledge to help nonprofits. For me and all other students, like we're starting to navigate like the corporate world and trying to enter the workforce while still trying to combine our passion of ESG. So what advice would you give to someone trying to balance their passion for social impact and sustainability and business? Do you believe it is possible to combine the two and find a good balance?
100%. It's possible. Couple of suggestions. So, A would be to look for roles in companies or sectors that prioritize social impact. So, a form answering a bunch of questions that B Corp, the actual business, has decided are qualifying factors to be considered a responsible or impactful business. Other roles in companies or sectors that prioritize social impact. So, social enterprises, as I said, so those are businesses that work both for profit and for impact, or sustainability or impact focused divisions within larger firms. So, as I mentioned at Deloitte, I've done some sustainability work within the firm, certainly possible. I know that a lot of the large banks in Canada have ESG arms or sustainable investing arms. So, even if folks want to move into corporations, there's still opportunities to work in roles that have social or environmental impact.
Mhm.
I would say B would be use your business acumen, whether it's in strategy, ops, finance, marketing. All of these skills and pieces of knowledge or expertise are certainly valuable in driving social and environmental incomes. Like, they nonprofit organizations, social enterprises, corporations like really need these skills to design and scale solutions with impact. So don't feel like your business degree won't get you anywhere. Week it's certainly valued. And then I would say number three would be advocate for change from within an organization. So if you're in a traditional business, you're not sitting on a sustainability or social impact team. I think, it's totally possible to champion sustainability initiatives or social impact initiatives or corporate social responsibility initiatives. I've seen this happen in a lot of corporations where, they haven't traditionally focused in this space, but having people internally kind of push for it and identify ways in which they could operate differently or engage with communities differently. There's certainly opportunities there for people as well.
That is so exciting to hear. I feel like it's definitely a growing space, but I think it's kind of hard to like find your way into it. Is there definitely like job offers get
100%. And I would say too, what can be a bit challenging from like just reflecting on my own experience is striking that balance of finding a job that pays enough to afford you the lifestyle you want to live, but still is attached to your purpose. And I think over the course of how long since I graduated, a decade now, I guess, I would say that I've seen a lot more opportunities come up that, pay well and are like either 100% or partially impact focused. And I think with the way the world is moving and sort of this next generation of leaders, I think that's only going to continue to increase as well.
It's really like good to hear, definitely for like me, and I'm sure a lot of other students listening to this podcast and just in general who definitely want to break into this space. I think that's all our time for today. Thank you so much for meeting with us and joining us today. I love getting to know a bit more about you and your work. It's so cool everything you've done, and you know so much in this sector from nonprofits to private sectors and how they intersect. So thank you so much.
Of course. Thanks so much, Erin. It was awesome to be on the podcast. So thanks for having me.